The COP29 climate meeting in Baku ended in disappointment last week. On the main issue of finance, developed countries agreed to mobilize only $300 billion for the developing nations every year, a three times increase over the current mandate of $100 billion, but way short of at least $1 trillion that all assessments said was required. Even this nominal scale up, the need already run up in trillions of dollars, is not supposed to happen immediately but only from 2035. This is not the first time that the annual climate conference has produced a disappointing outcome. Each one of them in the last 15 years has delivered much below expectations. As a result, the discussion and outcome of these summits have been almost completely delinked from the requirements of meeting the temperate targets mentioned in 2015 Paris Agreement. While science say that the world needs to cut its emission by at least 43% by 2030 from 2019 level, all assessment of current action estimate that global emission, even in the best case scenario, would be barely 2% by that time. The underwhelming deal on climate finance reached in Baku might just be the beginning of unraveling of climate talks. It is not surprised that the current international arrangement on climate change has turned out to be this ineffective. It is only major multilateral system which is completely aligned against the rich and powerful nations. Usually the rule of any international forum reflect the prevailing power balance and are mostly in favor of powerful as they are the ones who decide on the rules. The climate change architecture as presented by 1994 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change goes completely against this norm, and the system, the rich and the powerful, a group of about 40 including the United States and most of the Europe, are the main culprit for climate change, and they the rules are stacked heavily against them. They have been made solely responsible for cutting the greenhouse gas emission and also for providing money and technologies to the developing countries to help them fight climate change. These responsibilities were fixed largely with the polluter pay principle. Since the developed countries were mainly responsible for emitting GHG over the last 150 years, it was only fitting that they be asked to take responsibility for cleaning it up. However, equity and fairness are rarely the main driver of international relations. How this climate structure was allowed to be built up with the rich and developed countries fully participating in the process is an interesting and intriguing question that has not been settled fine definitely. It was not before the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the precursor of the Paris Agreement, was finalized that the developed world realized that this system could hurt their interests and disrupt the prevailing global power balance. The Kyoto Protocol took forward the principle enshrined in the UNFCCC and assigned a specific target to each of the developed nations in accordance with their guild. The target were to be fulfilled in a specific time frame, failing which they could be penalized. This is probably the only instance of an inherently unstable multilateral system to be created. The effort to dismantle the system began immediately after the Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005 after the requisite number of ratification. Although the US played a key role in finalizing the Kyoto Protocol, the country never ratified it. The idea was to tear down the structure brick by brick, not in one go. The crucial differentiation between the developed and developing countries in the assignment of climate responsibility was repeatedly targeted. This was done to ensure that the failure to meet the target could not be blamed only on the developed nations and instead be shared with everyone. The first attempt to replace the Kyoto Protocol with a new agreement was met in Copenhagen in 2009, but it failed. Developed countries worked for another 6 years and succeeded in Paris. But even while it was in force till 2020, Kyoto Protocol targets were completely ignored by all the developed countries. Many of them walked out of the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Agreement was the Paris Agreement meant fundamental changes to the way climate responsibility was structured till then. Emission cuts were not the sole responsibility of the developed countries any longer. Everyone had to contribute, though through in a nationally determined manner. There were no assigned target for developed countries. Their emission cuts also had to be decided by themselves. As a result, emission cuts have been nowhere close to what is required. The European Union is expected to cut its emission by around 60% from 2019 levels by 2030. The US has been the biggest laggard. Despite the much touted Inflation Reduction Act, the US is only aiming for a 50 the US has been biggest laggard. Despite the much touted Inflation Reduction Act, the US is only aiming for a 50 to 52% cut by 2030 from 2005 levels, which is about 45% from 2019 level. If the world has to reduce its emission by 43% by 2030 from 2019 level, equity and fairness demand that the US and EU should have been aiming for about 80 to 90% reductions. The sharp distinction between developed and developing countries on emission cuts was broken by Paris Agreement, but developed countries were still solely responsible for mobilizing finance and transfer of clean energy technologies. The developed countries argue that the scale of finance requirement has increased manifold and many other countries have grown rich in last 2 decades. So they must also be asked to contribute to climate finance. The first attempt to expand the contributor base happened in Paris itself, but did not succeed. It was one of the core issues being discussed as part of finance agreement in Baku, and some criteria for roping in more countries were suggested, but the developed countries managed to thwart it again. Essentially, China, which was the target of the expansion effort, put its foot down. In the bargain, the developed countries limited the quantum of climate finance to be raised by them will be $300 billion and no more. The dismantling of the international climate structure has been across the board, which has led to the continuous decline in the trust of developing countries. However, it is still the only multilateral forum where a small nation like Tuvalu or Marshall Islands have a voice and an influential one. These countries also benefit from some climate money flowing to them. It is not enough but better than nothing at all. The climate talks would be possibly continue to have limited utility for some more time. However, its effectiveness the climate talk would possibly continue to have limited utility for some more time. However, its effectiveness as a global forum to fight climate change is declining steadily.